The impression we have of the suffragettes a century after their activities is of heroic, long-suffering women who were prepared to undergo all manners of hardship in order to win the right to vote in parliamentary elections. They were knocked about by brutal police officers, and they went on hunger strike and underwent the horrors of forced feeding, all for something which today we regard as simple justice, political equality with men. There was also another side to the suffragettes, one of which we seldom hear. In addition to breaking windows and chaining themselves to railings, they also conducted a ferocious campaign of bombing and arson, causing explosions in places as varied as Westminster Abbey, Newcastle town centre, as well as a number of churches and railway stations. This is the story of 20th century Britain's first terrorist campaign, the forgotten history of the suffragette bombers. 25 million people in Britain, as well as hundreds of millions of other people throughout the world, watched the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympic Games in London. Danny Boyle, who staged the opening ceremony, said that the whole thing was inspired by Emily Davison, the lonely middle-aged woman who committed suicide by throwing herself beneath the King's horse at the 1913 Derby. She's shown in the ceremony with arms outstretched in a conscious pastiche of Christian iconography, and we're invited to see her as a suffering martyr. This symbolises our view today, the suffragettes as victims. Hardly any of the people who watched the opening of the Olympics would have known that this famous suffragette was not so much a noble martyr as a suicidal terrorist bomber. Emily Davison detonated the first terrorist bomb to go off in Britain in the 20th century. In 1913, Chancellor of the Exchequer Lloyd George was having a house built in Surrey. In the early hours of 19th of February, Emily Davison, together with a couple of other suffragettes, planted a bomb in the house which practically destroyed it. This was no lone wolf or maverick attack. Emmeline Pankhurst, leader of the suffragettes, was tried at the Old Bailey a couple of months later and sent to prison for 3 years for inciting terrorism for her role in the attack. Before going any further, who were the suffragettes? For several decades towards the end of the 19th century, some women who were known as suffragists had been working patiently in order to get political rights for women, including the right to vote. And by 1900 they had acquired the right to vote in local elections, to stand as county councillors and to sit on the newly formed school boards. In 1903 an organisation was founded by Emmeline Pankhurst called the Women's Social and Political Union, and these were women who were not prepared to wait. They didn't want any patient work, they wanted change immediately. The suffragists were horrified by some of the activities of the new Women's Social and Political Union, who became known as the Suffragettes. They were breaking windows, spitting at police officers and disrupting political meetings. Incidentally, they weren't known as suffragettes at the time. It wasn't until 1906 that the Daily Mail coined the expression suffragette, which was meant to be a derogatory term for them. But it stuck, and that's how we know them today. Emily Davison decided to take the activities of the suffragettes to a new level by using arson, the first time this had been used in Britain in the 20th century as a political weapon. On the 8th of December 1911, she posted some burning rags in the letterbox of Fleet Street Post Office, and a few days later set fire to 2 pillar boxes by the same means. Other suffragettes joined in and started setting fire to letters, and in retrospect we tend to regard this as being a bit of a harmless jape, a little vandalism, but there was a good deal more to it than that. In addition to burning rags, the suffragettes were pouring concentrated sulphuric acid into pillar boxes and sending glass bottles of phosphorus through the post. A number of postmen had their hands burned when they were emptying pillar boxes by acid, and some postal workers' lungs were damaged by burning phosphorus when the bottles broke in the sorting office. Indeed, in one case, a mail train actually caught fire when a suffragette incendiary device went off, and one of the workers there was quite seriously injured by the fire. Arson was attracting more attention than broken windows, and so inevitably the habit spread. The Church of England, for example, was not wholly in favour of votes for women, and so setting fire to churches became the next tactic in the arson campaign. Other buildings were also burned down, including restaurants and railway stations. Combined with arson, a new method emerged, that of planting bombs. The day after Mrs. Pankhurst was convicted at the Old Bailey of complicity in bombing, a bomb was found outside the Bank of England in London. Luckily, a policeman managed to throw it in a nearby fountain and stopped it from exploding, but afterwards the bombs came thick and fast. The targets ranged from St Paul's Cathedral in London to the Liverpool Cotton Exchange, from a greenhouse in Manchester to Westminster Abbey in London. Some of the bombs very nearly killed people. For example, one was set off in a railway station in Liverpool. Another one destroyed the Cactus House in Alexandra Park in Manchester. An explosion even took place at Roslin Chapel, the church in Scotland made famous in the book and film The Da Vinci Code. Another one went off at St Martin's in the Field Church in Trafalgar Square, showering passers-by with broken glass in the late evening. Some of the attacks were very serious. 2 charges of dynamite were set off outside Holloway Prison, and they caused the windows in nearby houses to shatter, spreading shards of glass over the beds of sleeping children. The arson attacks were getting worse as well. Shortly after the bomb at Holloway Prison, the Royal Dockyards in Portsmouth were attacked and set on fire. 2 men died as a result. What effect did all this terrorism, and there is really no other word for it, have on the struggle for women's rights? All the effects were negative. We sometimes think of the Edwardian world as being peaceful and opulent, the high watermark of empire, but it wasn't really at all like that. There was rioting, strikes, fear of war with Germany, and even the threat of civil war within the United Kingdom. Ireland was in turmoil, with nationalists seeking home rule, while at the same time the army, who were in charge in Ireland, were threatening to disobey orders, which would have been a terrible disaster for the government at that time. And all of the time, Germany was watching Britain to see how strong the government was, to see how far they could get away with manoeuvres in Europe and in North Africa. Any sign of weakness would have given the worst possible signal to Irish Republicans and the Germans. In 1914 came the worst violence yet. The first terrorist bomb in 20th century Ireland exploded in Lisbon in Northern Ireland, shattering windows and damaging stonework at Christ Church Cathedral. Then came a bomb in Westminster Abbey and others at churches in central London. The government wanted to compromise, but they couldn't do so. It was simply impossible. The suffragettes had backed themselves into a corner. By the summer of 1914, it looked as though the cause of votes for women was dead, and that it had been killed off by the actions of the suffragettes. Neither politicians nor ordinary men or women had any sympathy at all for those planting bombs. The suffragettes were seen in the same light that the IRA would later be viewed in Britain. The suffragettes invented the hunger strike. A lot of what the IRA did was modelled on the suffragettes, in fact. The hunger strike, letter bombs, incendiary devices. The government in Westminster were determined to crack down on what was seen as an increasingly dangerous movement. In June 1914, the Home Secretary stood up in the House of Commons to announce new measures to rein in the Women's Social and Political Union. He had no sooner opened his mouth than a sharp crack was heard. A bomb had exploded in nearby Westminster Abbey. Nobody knew it then, but this was almost the end of the suffragette movement. Within a few weeks, the First World War had started, and Emmeline Pankhurst called for a ceasefire. She and her suffragettes threw themselves into war work and abandoned the struggle for women's suffrage. All that the suffragettes had really achieved with their terrorism was to delay the inevitable. Other countries had granted women the vote before the First World War. New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Finland. During the First World War, other countries did while war was actually going on, and immediately after the end of the war, a lot of other countries were giving women the votes. Britain simply followed the worldwide trend. And in 1918, women were able to vote for the first time in Britain. Our collective memory of the suffragettes as noble women who were prepared to suffer for a cause without harming others is flawed. The suffragettes were pioneers of modern terrorism, and the fact that none of their bombs killed anybody was a matter of sheer chance. They set off explosives in very public places at times when the public were present, in streets and cathedrals, railway stations and public greenhouses. Rather than being the patient and long-suffering victims of male oppression through force feeding and so on, they were the architects of 20th century terrorism, setting out a pattern which has been followed by others, from the IRA to present-day Islamists.